What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and show where I, Graham G. Matthews, break down all the original content you watch on the WWE Network and on Peacock and on Vice. As today we're talking Season 4, Episode 3 of Dark Side of the Ring, entitled Breaking the Cycle, the Graham Dynasty. Obviously all about the Graham family. Mike Graham, Eddie Graham, their Mike's daughter, son, who also killed himself, unfortunately. I think a lot of wrestling fans probably know the Graham family story. I honestly did not. I knew Mike Graham. I've heard the name, the Graham family name quite a bit from Eddie Graham, Mike Graham, whatever. Obviously, not a big territory guy myself, so I hadn't seen any of their work. The biggest thing that I knew Mike Graham from, and how I knew the name initially, was actually from that WCW documentary that WWE did, The Rise and Fall of WCW, or whatever it was called. Not the book that came out around that same time, but the WCW documentary that WWE did in 2010. And Mike Graham, I don't know how much he was on it, but I remember it's a pretty memorable, iconic line when he said that Jeff Jarrett broke 1,000 guitars, never drew a dime. And they have like that shot of Jeff Jarrett taking off like the lucha mask or whatever. So I remember him from that. I always knew the name of Mike Graham, and that was back in, again, late 2000s, probably not even 2010, probably like 09 or so. And I own that documentary. I've seen it a bunch. I've seen it a ton of times. I forgot exactly what year he died. They didn't say, I don't think, what year he killed himself. It was after that, though, obviously. So I don't remember when I read the news or heard about him when he died. But it was obviously probably within the last 10 years, maybe around 2012, 2013, because his son killed himself first, and his grandfather was not the first, because Eddie, who was the grandfather, a lot of death, obviously, as we'll get to in this episode. We found out a little bit later on that his father killed himself and Eddie's brother. So followed by Eddie, then Mike's son. Mike was the son of Eddie. Mike's son, Steven, who is the brother of Nicole, who's a lot on this episode. She's featured quite a bit, which was great. She came across really, really well. And then lastly, Mike. He was the last one a number of years ago. So we'll get into it here, but they talk about the Championship Wrestling from Florida promotion, which we heard a lot about in the Tales from the Territory show, a number of months ago, late last year. Cornette's kind of like the biggest talking head on this episode. He was very close to the Graham family, worked with them a lot in CWF, Championship Wrestling from Hollywood. He was a big wrestling historian, so he knows all about the Graham family. And he talks about their importance, the Graham family's importance to wrestling in Florida. We hear from Mike's daughter, Nicole Gossett, I think is how you say the last name. She talks a lot about how, as a kid, she met a lot of different wrestlers, sleeping on their couch and stuff like that. Everyone wanted to learn from Eddie. And Kevin Sullivan talked about how he worked for them for decades in that Florida territory. We hear from Don Curtis's wife, Dottie, and Don Curtis was someone who met Eddie in 1952, and they were the tag team, the Golden Graham Brothers. And that's actually where Eddie got his name, from Dr. Jerry Graham. Eddie Graham is not his real name. He got that from his original name is Eddie Gossett. That's his real name, Eddie Gossett. But he adopted the Graham surname from Dr. Jerry Graham, who was his tag team partner. Biggest thing to happen in the territories at that point, they were main eventing Madison Square Garden, among other places. But their biggest downfall as a team was that Jerry was a massive alcoholic. He actually brought guns into a hospital after his mom died. He told the doctors beforehand, if my mom dies, I'll be back, and they're basically going to be held to pay, is what he said. The mom does indeed die. He comes back with guns and a knife and attempts to shoot a doctor. I don't know if he actually killed anyone. I don't think so. But he was a raging lunatic, and he took his mom's corpse and walked out with it. I don't know what the aftermath of that was, but it wasn't good. And pretty fucking psychotic person. So it wasn't long after that Eddie just said enough was enough. He couldn't put up with being partners with Jerry anymore. He left New York, moved to Tampa with his entire family, and knew that he could be successful there. And that was really when the wrestling boom happened in Florida. We hear a lot from B. Brian Blair, who's been on a bunch of episodes of Dark Side in the past. He started in Florida in 1977. We hear about how Eddie served as the president of NWA twice at two different points. And they recall, all the talking heads kind of recall him being a tough, very violent person. And Blair was one of the people that was told to break people's bones, do stuff that he wasn't proud of, but he had to do to keep his job. Kevin Sullivan, same thing. He was actually told to make someone bleed pretty violently because his job was on the line, not the person that he was making bleed. So pretty fucking disgusting stuff. But Eddie was a pretty charitable person. He not only wanted to receive checks, but write checks. He enjoyed that He enjoyed that more than getting checks, I guess. So he got involved with charity, was involved with the amateur wrestling and funding that sort of stuff, getting it going in that part of Florida, I believe. He got politicians involved in championship wrestling from Florida. So everyone knew who Eddie was. He was like a massive celebrity, a massive star in Florida around that time. But drinking was also his downfall, a lot like Jerry Graham. So he used to take his boat out while drinking, almost died, almost jumped on the boat. And the way I'm describing it doesn't emphasize how serious the situation was, but he almost killed himself by accident. And that was a kind of sobering moment for him as far as realizing that his alcohol was a problem. His son, Mike, followed in his footsteps into the business. And he didn't have the charisma of his dad, and he was kind of on the shorter side, but he did have a lot of knowledge. He was very knowledgeable about wrestling. He helped his dad run the territory at a certain point years later. Dusty Rhodes, very close with the family. Eddie retires in his 50s, and it was soon after that his life took a turn for the worse. He was consumed by alcohol, medication, because he was always beat the fuck up. So he turned to medication, painkillers, stuff like that, alcohol, wine specifically. The wine shop, the liquor store, was closed one time when he went to go get wine. So he was so desperate, he actually drank what was left of empty wine bottles in a fucking field. Like, that's pretty desperate. That's pretty gross. And essentially, he couldn't deal with not having an identity outside of wrestling. He would go out in public years later and wouldn't be recognized, and he couldn't deal with that because he liked the fame. And the last check, I think Nicole said that he wrote, was to a liquor store for $8. And it said that it said on the thing, peace of mind. That's what I guess the liquor was for his own peace of mind. It was like the running motto throughout the family, and I'll get to that later. But he didn't have peace of mind. That was his problem. So he turned 55. They have a birthday party for him. Nicole, who was a kid at that point, kind of, just childishly asks her grandfather, "Oh, what did you get for your birthday?" And he said 55 years, and she didn't understand, but she understands now. He meant to say he got 55 years out of life, and that was it for him. So Dottie and Mike recall Eddie shooting himself twice. Dottie wasn't there, Mike wasn't there either, but they remember the incident. We don't hear from Mike in real time, obviously, because he's since passed away, which I'll get to. But it was from, we hear his voice from a 2010 interview, recalling the incident. And he gets pretty emotional talking about it. He shot himself twice. It was pretty clear it was intentional. And he didn't kill himself. He attempted to, but he didn't die. He was in the hospital. And it was pretty clear, listen, this was intentional. He wanted to kill himself. We got to pull the plug. He died within 5 minutes. No one knew he was that depressed. So within a year, Vince got involved with Championship Wrestling Championship Wrestling from Florida, rather. And that was kind of like the beginning of the end for the promotion. Dusty left a year before Eddie killed himself, and that kind of hurt his ego, and that really hurt the territory. I think he went to WWE at that point, actually, and he took a lot of the talent with him. So Mike took over for Eddie in Eddie's absence, but the promotion just wasn't the same. He used his father's death, Eddie's death, in a desperate storyline to really garner attention, and it was pretty clear, according to Cornette, that it was desperate and people didn't take to it. It felt like a very cheap tactic. The promotion closed 2 years later. So Mike joined WCW around 40. That was around a time when he was mentoring younger guys, and that was kind of like his new purpose in the wrestling business. And he became bitter when wrestling shifted to more a theatric side of the business because he didn't like that he was very old school. So he was out of the business for a long time up until his passing, where he enjoyed racing boats, doing that sort of stuff. He got a Peace of Mind tattoo, actually, with a tattoo with a design that said Peace of Mind underneath it. But he also had a drinking problem as well, a lot like his father. He had two different driving licenses, actually, the daughter said. One under Mike Graham and one under Mike Gossett, his real name. And he got DUIs under both names. The daughter, she recalls Mike being miserable after his father, Eddie, died. Nicole's brother, Steven, it was Nicole and Steven were the two kids of Mike. And I guess the mentality was that he would be a lot tougher than he actually was because of who his family was, and maybe they expected him to get into the business. I'm not sure. I mean, Mike was, I almost knocked something over there by accident. Mike was out of the business at that point, so I'm not sure if they didn't really talk about that he was expected to break into wrestling. I don't think so. But I guess the mentality of being macho and just the expectation and the pressure of that really weighed on him, and he actually ended up killing himself as well. He committed suicide. And they talk about how Steven probably saw suicide as an option because of what Eddie did to himself years earlier, the grandfather. Mike blamed himself as any father would or any son would, realizing I probably did something wrong as a son or as a father for this stuff to happen. And Nicole met up with them one day. It was him, her, and her daughter, who was a kid. And she said, listen, it's got to end there. We're still recovering from this. It's got to end here. Don't consider anything. Like, stay alive for my daughter. Like, what do you think? What type of toll do you think it would take on her? That sort of thing. And he was like, oh, okay. But literally within 2 years later, within 2 years, he also killed himself. He was dead within 2 years. And they talk about how he killed himself when his wife went outside to go see friends or something. And she heard a gunshot. She came back inside. He was dead on the bed wearing Steven's cowboy boots. So again, it was intentional. Nicole recalls how that death of her father was a different type of pain from Steven's because they were still recovering from that one. Cornette recalls being shocked. He hadn't seen Mike in years, but for there to be multiple deaths in the same family, a lot like with the Von Erichs, just completely shocking to him being on the outside of the family. And it wasn't just them. Like I said earlier, they mentioned here how Eddie's father and brother, Skip, I think his name was, also killed themselves. They also were victims of suicide. So to close out the episode, it does end on a somewhat nice note. I mean, this is a very fucking depressing episode, but Nicole shows off a tribute that one of Eddie's old rivals and opponents, the son of one of their old rivals or opponents, put together as a tribute to the Championship from Wrestling from Florida territory, and kind of like the impact it had specifically to the Graham family, and she gets emotional. Checking that out, she remembers each of them and how much, how good people they were, her grandfather, her brother, her father, and the impact they all had on her and whatnot. She talks about her own recovery from the pain and finding the crisis center of Tampa Bay and how that's really helped her. And she's in a great place now, being very happy, and things are great. Family's great. Friends are great. She has kids, at least that daughter, probably more than one. But I remember the daughter from what she mentioned earlier in the episode. And she mentions that she's the happiest I think she's ever been now, which is great. So, and they also flash up the graphic for the suicide prevention hotline to call if you're ever dealing with suicidal thoughts and stuff like that. So I'm glad they put that up for episodes like this, like the Von Erich one, because it is very, timely, and to just kind of, just to have that as an option if it's something that you're experiencing or going through, or if you know someone that's going through that. So, again, it's tough to say with stuff like that it's a good episode because it's so depressing and it's so sad and it deals with such sensitive subject matter. It was a good quote-unquote episode in the sense that I learned a lot that I did not know about the Graham family. I really knew next to nothing. Aside from a little bit about Mike Graham, I had heard the family name a lot, but I knew nothing about Eddie Graham, Dr. Jerry Graham, Mike Graham, or his family and the suicide stuff. I knew he had died, but I didn't know that he had killed himself and that the suicide stuff ran in the family. I didn't even know about that until the Dark Side of the Ring lineup was announced. And I just don't know about that sort of stuff from the territory days. So, an interesting episode. I mean, they're all worth checking out. There's not one I would say, oh, skip this one. It's not entertaining. I can't say, oh, it's a great episode. Like, it does leave you feeling very like, man, it's fucking awful, just stuff to kind of carry into your own life and your own experiences, people puts things in perspective. An interesting, informative episode. I can't say I enjoyed it, per se, but it was a good episode in terms of how it was done, the talking heads, and everything they covered. Not the actual subject matter, but in terms of the way they ran it down, and just a very informative look at their careers and life and the impact they leave behind. Thank you guys for checking out my review of the show, Dark Side of the Ring, the Breaking the Cycle, the Graham Dynasty episode. Be sure to check it out now on Vice. New episode next week. Forgot what it's on, so we'll find out when I watch it, review it next week here on the channel, so keep an eye out for that. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. Have a great rest of your weekend, folks. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.